Johncox, and I'm head of Enness Dubai. For those of you that don't know us, Enness is the world's leading high net worth and ultra high net worth mortgage brokerage. We work with over 300 institutions globally, and we have offices in London, Monaco, Jersey, Dubai, and representation in Geneva, Singapore, Paris, and a number of other European cities. Today's webinar, I'm going to be joined by Emily Lui, who, if she can turn her camera on. Hey, it's Emily. So today I'm joined by Emily Lui. Emily is a great friend of mine and top London real estate lawyer. She works for and is partner in a firm called Seddons just on Portman Square, and she manages a team of 15 hotshot real estate lawyers who can look after pretty much anything you would ever need. Seddons is, like I said, a London-based law firm, multi-practice, leading private client firm with services including property, immigration, succession planning, structuring, family planning, and litigation. Emily, how are you doing?
Good to see you.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you for joining us today. Emily's got a little dog, so we talk a lot about our dogs, and her dog is currently in at the vets, so having a tough day, but hopefully back soon. Yeah,
hopefully by the time we're done, she'll be done too.
Well, hopefully we don't talk for too long. Yeah, exactly. So look, today's webinar is really on the legal conveyancing process for London real estate and UK real estate, and also how London lawyers and UK lawyers are adapting to the pandemic. So there will be a Q&A at the end. So any questions that do come up, do just hold on to them, and we'll answer. We'll put them in the Q&A, and then we'll answer them at the end. So to start with, Emily's going to give us a bit of a whistle-stop tour into what lawyers do as part of the property purchase.
Exactly. So you have worked really hard to find the property that you want to buy. You've negotiated hard on the price, everything's moving, and then you instruct your lawyers and everyone says that everything stops for weeks. And the deal is kind of stuck until the lawyers have done their thing. Now, the reason for that is that the buying process in the UK requires us to do all of our due diligence, the legal due diligence on the property before we exchange contracts. It's something called buyer beware, which means that once we've exchanged contracts in England, you have to take the property as it is. So before you exchange, you've got to make sure all the legals are in place, you're happy physically with the property, and your mortgage and your funding is in place. So the process is you have your offer accepted, you instruct your lawyers gets papers, then what we do is we have to order searches, which are things that are available on public registers, making sure there's nothing nasty in there relating to the property. We need
Emily, the searches are a third party, so you request those from the local authorities, right?
Exactly. So that could be the local authority where the property is, water and drainage, environmental, to make sure that the property wasn't built on anything nasty, contaminated land, that kind of thing. So what we're looking for is nasty things that could have an effect on the desirability of the property and the value of the property. We look at the legal title of the property, and what we do is we look at everything. We raise inquiries, so questions, the seller's solicitor gathers answers, sends them back to us, and then when we're happy with everything, we've got to report to our clients, to our buyers, making sure that they understand what they're buying, what they're getting themselves into. Once we have done that, then we're ready to exchange, and that's, after we've got mortgage offer in as well. So that's where you guys would come in to get that sorted before exchange.
Yeah, I think whenever we're talking to clients, I kind of talk, there's the offer, and then it kind of splits into two ways. You have the mortgage process underneath, and then the legal conveyancing process on top, and they kind of run in unison. But there's a lot of different bits that happen part of that legal process, and then you come back together when you've got the mortgage offer, searches, KYC, etc. done, join together, and then that's at the point everyone looks to exchange.
Exactly. So basically everything has to be in place for exchange on a normal deal. So you exchange, and at that point you put 10% deposit down and you set a completion date. And people are like, well, what completion date, closing date can I have? It's actually a logistical date. From a legal point of view, we've done all the legal work. There's nothing really else for us to do apart from get signed documents, people moving if they need to get removals, and money in. So we've had it before where clients are like, okay, yeah, I can close in 5 days. And then they realize that their money's on a term deposit and it's going to take them 30 days to release it. So it's really a logistical date. So it's not a legal point, it's whatever suits everybody's circumstances.
Yeah, fine. And then I think that the big topic that everyone likes to ask lawyers is around, obviously everyone's price sensitive and cost sensitive, but stamp duty, land tax is one of the big costs of buying UK and well, global real estate, but UK is a hot topic at the moment. I think everyone sort of knows the general tiered system that's utilised in the UK, but something that is always coming up in my conversations is the sort of extra stamp duty that people need to pay when they're buying second, third, fourth, 100th properties. What is that? It's 3%, right?
Yeah, so it's an extra 3% on every band. So we now have a band sliding scale. And so what the government have said, and they've been really aggressive when they put this in, they said, if you or your spouse own any residential property worldwide worth over a certain amount, which is a really small amount, in your names or as a beneficiary of a trust, then you will be subject to the higher rate. The main sort of question mark or we get from our clients is, well, if say wife is buying a property, the first property in her name, but her husband owns, say, the main house in another country, in their minds, this is the wife's first property, so she should just pay the normal rate. But actually, because the government take husband and wife as a single family, the husband's ownership comes into place, so you have to pay the higher rates. You're caught, and it's inadvertent. It's something that people don't always realise.
Yeah, I think, the way the world is these days, everyone's not settling down at 18, 19, 20 years old, getting married, buying their first house before they're 25. People are buying later, and often I think when you come into relationships, one or the other party own a property already, and then you want to move together into the bigger property, and all of a sudden it pops up because you don't think it's it's not a second home, it's your first home, right? One thing that just springs to my head though, that if you do pay the high rate band on your next purchase, if you were buying with your wife or husband, etc., am I right if you said it within a year, there's potentially a refund on the extra, or within a set period of time?
So there are certain rules that allow you to pay the standard rate or claim back any extra you've paid if you're buying and selling your main residence. So if you're in a position where you've got your main residence, but you're going to move to a new main residence, so that's the one we buy, we have to pay the extra 3% because on the day of completion, you would have had two properties.
Two properties,
Exactly. But then if you sell your existing main residence within a certain time period, then you can claim back the extra. And apparently, they actually give the money back fairly quickly. Most clients get it back, and it's something they can do themselves. You don't need a lawyer to do it. You don't need an accountant to do it. You just need a bit of info, and it's an online form. Fill it in. Most people seem to get their money within a couple of months. I did have one client, and it was a particularly large amount of money, so they hung on to that as long as they could, but they did eventually give it back.
Anyone sensible would hold on to their money for as long as they could, right? Especially if it's a large amount. So look, one thing that I didn't know about, and you brought up, which I thought was really interesting yesterday when we were just having the preamble on this, is this sort of granny flat. So that's where, if I'm right, you're buying a property upstairs that might have a ground floor or lower ground floor single flat underneath or something similar. And there's some sort of relief or saving that could be made when buying those properties.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that, we have a lot of properties where the basement might be used or sort of created in a way that can be used as a separate dwelling, or a granny annex above the garage. If you've got a nice big property and you've got a separate garage, there's a granny annex on top of that. And there are rules around this. And if the circumstances are met, you can have something called multiple dwellings relief, which could substantially reduce the stamp duty that you've got to pay. So it is something that when you're looking to buy a property, it needs to be looked into properly by an SDLT expert to be able to say, actually, this actually qualifies, or it doesn't qualify, but hopefully it will, and it will have a saving that is there.
Okay, and that's the property, even if it's on a single title, is that correct? Or does it
Correct.
need to be split title?
Doesn't need to be split title at all. Needs to be pretty much 2 dwellings. Fine.
And how is that proven? Do they come around and have a look around your house, or is it just a declaration the lawyers make?
What we normally suggest in these circumstances is that, stamp duty is a self-assessed tax, so it's up to the person buying the property to declare the right amount. So if there is an investigation by the Inland Revenue later on, you're going to have to prove how you came to that result, that it should be 2 dwellings and this relief applies. So we suggest that paperwork's kept, plans, and to get proper written SDLT advice showing that you actually considered this properly and it was a relief that applied to this property. So not go on.
Not on a whim at all. So that's just something I'd never even heard of, and obviously been in game quite some time. So look, the other things that I guess a lawyer would also help and touch on would be your tax planning, your ownership structure planning, and the best ways of owning, buying, and making a purchase streamlined. We won't go into that today purposely, because I'm planning another webinar next week and I need topics to talk about. But I think in short, what's really important to me to note here is, everyone runs into buying property, or historically have, obviously post-pandemic we'll see, but buying the property first and then thinking about their team afterwards, i.e. mortgage, solicitors, structure, etc., etc. I think what is critical, and it will be more so coming out of the pandemic, and it'd be interesting your opinion on this, but building, and I've talked about this in all of my webinars so far, is building a good team around you before you start looking for property. So, the agents to get the best property, your mortgage brokerage, obviously Enness, to make sure that you get the sort of financing in the best way. But the lawyers is absolutely critical in terms of speed of transaction, the correct advice. You mentioned the stamp duty is a self-declared tax, but if someone gets that wrong, if they don't identify your own second properties, they don't realise your wife owns a property, whatever it might be, all these things that potentially sleepier cities or sleepier law firms might not notice. It's just absolutely critical to get a good lawyer on board as early as possible. And we've had cases that we've discussed together whereby, KYC can be an issue, and that can take some time. So getting all these things done at the start of the process rather than at the end is sort of absolutely critical. So look, I think what I'm more interested in now today, though, is the pandemic, the thing we're very much involved in. It's in the news every day. Boris Johnson made a speech on Sunday night and decided to sort of tell you what we already knew, which is good of him. But how are lawyers adapting in the pandemic? It's a relationship business. It's a face-to-face business. You're the gatekeeper. You look after everything. What are you doing, KYC wise to sort of keep transacting?
So, the great part for me is that we are in a very sort of old-fashioned industry. Conveyancing has been around since forever. And a lot of firms that we have to deal with don't modernize their practices. So they'll like to put things in the post and they'll take 3 days to come to me. So the things that I really like about this is that everybody's been forced to modernize. Everyone has to use email to communicate, more phone calls, etc. So from that point of view, I think transactions can be sped up because you're not waiting around for things that have been put in the post. Now, KYC is an interesting one because the government have put a real burden, let's call it that, on lawyers, estate agents, finance advisors to verify the clients and the source of funds. The pandemic has not stopped that obligation. It hasn't weakened it in any way. And in fact, we've been getting warnings from our regulatory bodies to say you need to be more aware of potential fraud, because in this weird sort of scenario place that we're in, some fraudsters are taking advantage of that, and you can see that with the everyday emails people get from their banks.
Absolutely, the amount of spam and sort of email and internet fraud that's been going on at the moment. From what I read on the internet, which could be spam, of course, is skyrocketing, right? I guess all these guys have more time on their hands, and also people have more time on their hands to, you know, to not be rushing around, and therefore maybe just as focused. But yeah, so it's just as, if not more critical now, right?
Exactly. But we have, you know, there are certain things that we have to do. We have to be able to identify who our client is. And ordinarily, if it's someone, say, for example, who's in London, they'd pop into the office for 5 minutes, they'd bring their passport, their original, they'll bring an original bill or bank statement dated in the last 3 months, and they'd produce it to us, and we'd take certified copies, and that bit will be done. And the rest of it we can do online. For offshore clients, if they weren't in London, you'd send them off to a notary or a lawyer in that jurisdiction, and they'd basically do the same thing, and they'd send it to us. But we're all in lockdown. What do we do? So we've had to sort of come up with ways, and it is very much based on a risk-based process. So depending on who the client is, where they are, what information we've got from them, we sort of have to change our practices slightly. But, you know, in essence, we're doing a lot more FaceTime and video calls with them and their ID. Things like that. We've had to be a little bit more agile.
Yeah, well, this is a great example. One of my colleagues had and we never thought we'd see it, but a bank request a client take a selfie, if that's even in the Oxford Dictionary, with his passport just held up. Now, I've done it before to register for some apps and things like that, but I've never seen that in you know, in the professional world. But I guess you know, that's the new world order, and people are adapting very, very, very quickly. What, you know, in terms of going digital, you also, you know, historically talk posting documents, and the main reason for that is wet ink signatures. What is it about this wet ink signature that's any different to a sort of soft copy signature, or is that archaic now?
So we, as lawyers, for deeds, we like to have wet ink signatures because it's undeniable proof that that document has been signed. We're in an environment where it is hard to actually, you know, you can have a client who can print something. If they have a printer, they could sign it, but then what do you do with it? How do you get it to where it needs to be? So the Land Registry have actually modernised their practice for the moment, and I don't necessarily know whether this will be carried forward in the future, but they will accept for registration documents that have been signed physically, witnessed physically, but then PDF'd or photo sent to their lawyer for them to be submitted to them. Everyone has to agree the procedure. You've got to jump through a few hoops, but they are accepting that for the moment. The main issue isn't the wet signature, it's the witness. So we were talking about this yesterday. How do you witness a document when you have to stand, you know, at best you're going to get halfway across a room from someone? You know, how are you witnessing documents? I guess, you know, me in my house in Dubai, you know, and I need to get something witnessed. What, you know, do I pass it over the wall to my next door neighbour and then hope they pass it back, or how's that? You know, what's the solution there? It's going to have to be witnessing at the permitted safe distance or through a window. But then are you passing a pen to each other? Are people freaking out because they're touching paper? You know, you've got to think of all these things. So when I'm saying to a client, look, can you get this document witnessed? They have to actually go and find someone who is willing to be the witness. And, you know, it can't be a family member and, you know, husband, wife, and it has to be someone over the age of 18 as well. It's all good practice. I've got this imagination of sort of lawyers in hazmat suits running around the city of London collecting signed documents in sort of destructible boxes, a bit like the sort of guys from Monsters Inc. So we touched on it earlier in terms of searches have been a big part of making sure the property purchase is clear. You know, I remember when I was looking in East London for a period of time, there's sort of bomb searches, you know, areas of London that had been bombed in the Blitz, and that all comes up. So that these searches are very much all-encompassing. I also think local authorities tend to be sort of stuffy back offices somewhere. Have they adapted to this work from home world that we live in, technology driven, or, you know, what have you seen from that? Some of them have, some of them haven't. Pleasingly, most of the London councils have been able to provide some kind of service at a reasonable time period. So we haven't seen anything too bad. Funny enough, and I didn't expect this, Thames Water, who provides the water and drainage search, as soon as the lockdown happened, they weren't set up for remote working, and they had to basically shut down for a couple of weeks before they worked it all out. And they're back now, and it's fine. Some of the councils that are outside of London, perhaps you say they're a little bit more sleepy, they might be parish councils, whatever, they don't have the setup. But I've really noticed over the past couple of months that, everything seems to be working pretty much normally now.
Yeah, that's good, interesting. One thing I noticed, I think I mentioned this to you the other day, I applied for my non-resident landlord tax form through HMRC. And of course, the letter gets sent to the estate agent's property management department, and yet no one's been there for 2 months. So I'm still paying all the tax that I would do, that they're holding back on the rent. And it's simple, just because a letter's sat in Chiswick somewhere and they're sat at home in their pajamas. But my problem, so look, COVID-19, I've seen from our side of things in the mortgage world, COVID clauses in the valuation reports, just everyone, I guess, protecting themselves. What COVID clauses are you seeing in legal contracts, and how are they affecting buyers and sellers?
Yeah, so, if you exchange contract, that's it, you're bound. And if you don't complete for whatever reason, you're going to be in breach of contract. Now, in this scenario, we don't know what might prevent you completing. So could it be that you get sick and you have to self-isolate, so you can't move, can't go to the bank, you can't sign documents, you could end up in hospital, your removers might let you down, the bank might not be able to transfer money, you may lose your job, and you may have your mortgage offer withdrawn. We haven't seen that yet, but it's a possibility. And as lawyers, we're doomsday experts, so we'll come up with all the worst scenarios that we can think of. So one of our sort of industry sort of legal service providers has come up with some standard COVID-19 clauses, and basically what they say is, if for a COVID reason, which isn't strictly defined because we don't know what those reasons might be, a party cannot complete, then the completion date will be pushed back until they can complete, until completion can happen. But we have to have an end stop date in a contract. It can never be open-ended. So we have to have what we call a long stop date. And if you ever reach that date, and it's a date that's agreed by the buyer and seller, like how long are you willing to wait for this deal? Or how long is your mortgage offer going to last for? That's normally the defining factor. Then you, at that point, if you still haven't completed, contract will come to an end, buyer gets their deposit back, everyone walks away, and nobody's in breach. So there's no financial consequence. Lovely sounding clauses, make perfect sense, but they are untested. No one's ever, no one's, they've not been put through any litigation. So they really are based on goodwill.
What's a realistic long stop date in today? I mean, I guess your mortgage offer 3 months, potentially extended if you think of it 6 months, but what's a realistic long stop date? I mean, how do you sort of pick the date?
Exactly. It's for us, if you've got a mortgage and you know when it's going to expire, then your long stop date will be a couple of weeks before the expiry of your mortgage offer. But if you've not got a mortgage, it's really how long are the buyer and the seller willing to wait? It could be a couple of months, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months. The main issue is that they're based on goodwill. And if somebody decides not to act in good faith, then it's open to abuse.
Absolutely. And I think that lends nicely, and something we've seen in the press over the last few days, which is, I think, good news, which is the opening up of the UK real estate market after what has been 5, 6, 7 weeks of absolute lockdown, right? COVID guidance to buyers, I guess even tenants to an extent, but maybe not falling under your side of things. What guidance can you give to buyers who are now, and sellers for that matter, who would be buyers on the other side, who are moving into new properties? What are you sort of duty bound to tell them?
Yeah. Yes, the government have opened up the industry, which is allowing lettings, it's allowing transactions to happen, but these sort of reasons that completion might not take place are still there, because we are opening up the country very slowly. What happens if there's a second wave, there's another lockdown? There's still the possibility you might get sick. So the risks of still transacting are actually there. I guess the removals probably less so, because the removal companies are allowed to work. But again, if all of a sudden the government see a spike in infection rates, we could end up with another lockdown and the removal companies may or may not be able to work. So yes, it's a great thing, because it does mean that people can start looking, putting offers in, valuers can go in, surveyors can go in, but the risks are still there for us in terms of advising our clients, are you going to be able to complete when you've said you will? We've seen a little bit more sort of buyers being a little bit more cautious based upon their employment. Are they certain they're going to have the job that they've got at the money that they're earning now? So we've seen a little bit of nervousness surrounding that. I don't know if you've seen that on the mortgage side.
Yeah, I guess a touch, right? It's very difficult to put your finger on what, I guess you can get to the end of the month in terms of planning, but it's very difficult to get to the end of the year and the end of next year in terms of sort of forecasting your existence. So yeah, I mean, one of the topics we want to talk about is that change in buyers' mentality, right? The market's a very different place to when we're in a really booming market where people will turn a blind eye and they just complete it as soon as possible. I guess it's flipping back into potentially what would look like a buyer's market. And I'm guessing that means a lot more questions for lawyers.
Exactly. So, you're going to have a situation where a seller has probably taken an offer lower than they wanted. So that for them, the pressure is on, we want this deal done as quickly as possible. I get it. They've taken a price that they weren't originally going to be happy with. From a buyer's point of view, they've had this deal agreed, fantastic. They're still feeling a little bit nervous. Are they doing the right thing? Have they gone in too early? Is the price going to drop a bit more? But they kind of want to proceed. So if you come up with things in the legal paperwork that isn't quite right, so property that has been altered without the right planning conditions or building control documents, slight issues in the title, buyers are not tending towards taking a view that they would normally do because they're already feeling cautious. So that is one of the things that's harder to navigate. So things will take longer because buyers will be thinking about it more. Should I take a view on this? Should I press to get this fixed? What should I do? And there's that real sort of sense of, am I doing the right thing by buying? And this property's got a problem with it as well.
And I think I spoke with Becky about this last week in our webinar, which is the change of what is appealing. Now, you're in central London, living in central London, in lockdown in central London. Mm-hmm. Over the last 4 to 8 weeks, have you reconsidered whether central London is the place to be? And are you now looking for a country palace or
have I looked?
Or sort of not?
Yes.
I saw a statistic on one of the big leading estate agents saying something like 80% increase in countryside viewings. But what's interesting is actually those viewings are also following through to registrations for actual property viewings rather than just internet viewings. But it's got to change the outlook of the way people will consider outside space, high ceilings and things like that, right?
Definitely. We've all realised that we can work from home. Agile working is possible. It's forced everybody to do it if in an office environment to do that. So all of a sudden the thought of, okay, well, if I have to come to the office every day, I'm going to be commuting an hour and a half each way. Actually, you won't necessarily need to do that. You might only need to do that a couple of times a week or once a week, depending on the needs of you going physically into your office. Yeah. So I think there's going to be a real shift. I myself, I have a small balcony in the flat, and I have to go to Primrose Hill if I want to see some real sort of grass with the dog. Whereas, I'm talking to other lawyers on the phone or clients, and they're sitting in their country houses, on the terrace, whilst they're having Negroni, and it's like, that's quite a nice life.
Doesn't seem too bad, does it?
Not at all.
Doesn't seem. So that leads really nicely into, I guess, what will be the final topic, which is our industry. We both work in heavily relationship-based worlds. We rely on meeting clients, 3, 4, 5 times a day. And that hasn't happened in 8 weeks, but we have developed this world of technology. I say I haven't developed it, the world has developed it, and I'm utilising it to promote our Enness's services and also speak to various prospects. But, you know, post-COVID, do you see that world changing and everyone piling into London, New York, wherever it might be, to sit in coffee shops and meet clients? Or do you think the whole Zoom world, and note there are other providers of video conferences, but is that world here to stay?
I think it is. I think it is, actually. You know, the fact that we've kind of been having to get used to it for a couple of months, and realistically, we're probably going to be having to work like this potentially for the rest of the year. And I think at that point, we've been doing it so long that we will continue to do it. And actually, it's actually quite nice to see my clients, to discuss a particular point with them. You know, traditionally they would have either come into the office or had a sort of phone call, a faceless phone call. And actually it's quite nice to see them face to face and see their reaction and sort of gauge that. And I think that's really been an advantage. Also, you know, some lawyers are quite aggressive with each other, because we've had to have more phone calls, and because everybody's affected equally by COVID-19, and there's a lot more kind of, are you okay? Is everyone okay? Is your firm okay? You know, everyone's being a bit nicer to each other, and I've really enjoyed that.
Yeah, as you said yesterday, the barriers of human interaction have been broken down, and certainly in the legal world or the sort of city world, the sort of blue suit that protects you, you know, you put on your suit of armour, that's been completely broken down. You know, you're zooming into, you know, maybe some clients who are sitting on their veranda looking over the Côte d'Azur, but equally there'll be clients where you're zooming into their bedrooms or living rooms, and it really does break down. And there is an element of that makes you almost more closer to your clients than meeting them in a coffee shop. So no, it's a really interesting period of time, and I think there's a lot of changes, a lot of like adaptations that people are making that will remain long after COVID has settled, or at least the lockdown is over. So look, there's a couple of questions that have come in, which hopefully you're okay to answer briefly. So look, the first one, which is actually from our principal representative, Thomas, based in Geneva. He asked quite an interesting question that goes back to the stamp duty point. If I own a property held through so would stamp duty at 3% surcharge apply to someone who owns a property in their personal name and is buying their first buy-to-let property in a limited company?
A limited company is a separate legal entity. So the stamp duty rules are completely different for a company. So depending on how the company is going to use the property, it could be at a 15% rate or it could be at the higher rate. But that's a very special circumstance, special rules for companies. Exactly.
And I'll have to get in touch with Emily directly to get all the details. That's it. Perfect. Secondly, so one question that's come up, again, stamp duty, it seems to be more of a focus of this call. So, you know, avoiding stamp duty, deferring stamp duty, it's possible. We've all seen the schemes. Sensible way of mitigating your stamp duty, or is it really best just to sort of play the straight bat and pay up to HMRC?
You know, the government changed the rules, and they were, you know, they came down really strictly, and they've got really kind of wide arms now to catch schemes or structuring or whatever it might be. And you know, there are people that come up with certain schemes, and clients come to me saying, oh, I've heard this, or my friend's done this, etc., etc. And there are some barriers to that, because the solicitors governing body have issued warning cards regarding any kind of scheme, and they require us to do lots of things, and they don't consider them to be something that our clients should go for, that we should facilitate. But ultimately, you know, if a client is looking at these, they need to consider whether an inland revenue investigation is something that they want, because ultimately the inland revenue could open an investigation and then they could be on the inland revenue radar.
It's worth a think. Yeah, absolutely. Best to play the straight bat, I think. And then the final thing, which is really a question from me, you know, we've seen it probably more prominently recently, but ground rent escalation, and the way certainly the maybe newer properties It's, what we see in the UK, where, ground rent increasing by a multiple every 5 years being unacceptable to A, to lawyers, and B, to many of the lending institutions. So reverting for the sort of RPI or an indexed assessment of how to calculate ground rent. But, why is that an issue?
So it's a bit of a... So when leases were sort of granted in the 70s or 80s, they would have a ground rent that would say double every 25 years. So it'd start £25, it would double every 25 years for 100 years. And it wouldn't really be a problem. As time has gone on, developers particularly have realised that they can squeeze a little bit more money out of a potential development by charging a higher ground rent, so that the freehold of that development has value in it and it can be sold for good money. What has happened inadvertently is that it has created a scenario where leases, so long leases, we're talking of flats, so 125, 999-year leases, have come under a different set of legislation, which is actually meant for short-term lettings, so your AST agreements. So you've got your buy-to-let flat, it's probably on an AST, and it's covered by some legislation. So what's happened is we have a scenario where long leases have come inadvertently under the umbrella of this other legislation. And this other legislation makes it easier for a landlord to get possession if there's a breach of the terms of the lease. So for you and your AST, that's perfect, because your tenant's only in for 12 months. And if they haven't paid their rent, which is whatever it is per month, then of course you should be able to get your tenant out quickly. But that's not, but that also applies to a long lease. So somebody has spent £1 million on a new build flat, for example, and happens to forget to pay the ground rent. So in London, it has to be over £1,000, which often they are. So it forgets to pay the ground rent because they don't live here. It does mean that it is easier for the landlord to get possession of that property again. So we're hoping, we were hoping that there'd be a change in the law, but obviously with everything happened, I think it's pretty much on the back burner for the foreseeable future. So what do we do about it? There are indemnity policies, and you can try and ask the landlord to amend the terms of the lease. So there are things that can be done.
Perfect. Look, so we've run on for 40 minutes. I think everyone's stayed tuned and it's been really appreciated. Look, just for me, Emily's one of the most approachable lawyers in London. It's always free on email, phone call, whatever it might be, to answer any questions. And it's been a great help to me over the last couple of years. So, thank you for joining the webinar, and thank you for everything in work life. Hope everyone stays safe. We'll wind up now. If you want to contact Emily, Emily, if you just share your email address, maybe. Yeah, I will. We'll put it into the chat, shall we?
We'll put it into the chat. So now my technical ability is being really
challenge. I thought I'd give you a quick challenge.
Exactly. Thanks for that. Doing it now. Right. Yes, I've spelled my name right. There we go.
So if you need Emily, on her email, or obviously www.seddons.co.uk. I'm Toby Johncox, Enness, Dubai. And anything you need, of course, it's tj@enness.co.uk, and we can be found on the website as well. Thanks, Emily, and thanks
guys.
for joining us. Take care. Ciao.
Bye.